I'm smoking some ribs, which is kind of weird since like that's a dad thing in my mind. Like an older dad like would make his own food for his birthday. Like I would generally choose a restaurant or my wife would make something, but
Welcome to the Wokepedia podcast. The Wokepedia podcast is a ministry of enemies within the church. You can go to enemieswithinthechurch.com to, well, view the film, Enemies Within the Church. Learn about what is going on in this crazy modern world and specifically how it is affecting the church. You can also click on the tab at the top that says Wokepedia, and you can view all of our online resources as well. But this week is going to be an interesting interview. We have Jon Harris of the Conversations That Matter podcast joining Sam and I, and we're going to be having a little bit of a discussion on wokeness, on its origins, its history, some of the ideas surrounding that. We've had a couple episodes where we've talked a little bit about that, but we want to bring in some additional perspectives and engage in some deeper conversation. But Sam, how are you doing this week?
You know, Kyle, I'm doing pretty well. Last week, it was interesting because the temperatures in Iowa got down to like the 60s. And then this week, it is no longer in the 60s. I think we're, in about the 115s or something like that. Not quite that high, but it's, it's in the 90s. And as much humidity as in Florida is what I feel like here. So it's good though, even though I'm longing for winter. In fact, we had a Christmas in July here with our kids. Have you guys ever done anything like that? A Christmas in July where you go and break out a Christmas tree, put in a Christmas movie, start singing Christmas carols,
No?
No?
Think I've ever done anything like that, but that is the exact kind of thing that my wife would enjoy.
Yeah. Huh. It was fun. We watched A Christmas Carol and Frosty the Snowman, and now my son thinks it's going to snow every day and is very disappointed when he wakes up and realizes that it's not. So it's kind of fun in that realm too. But how are you doing, Kyle?
I'm doing really good. It's been blisteringly hot here, but luckily, this is one of the biggest points where our weather diverges from yours. After the final thunderstorm of spring, the humidity drops a ton. So we still get just as hot as you, but we don't have as much humidity. But we went down to the beach today, beach on a river, not on the ocean. And that was fun. And here's your children's safety tip from the Army Corps of Engineer for this week, which is life jackets worn, nobody mourns.
There we go. That's a good tip.
That's great advice for children. They have it on stickers too. It's great. But I think the real question that people are asking right now is, Jon, how are you doing this week? And, how are you, are you excited to get into a little bit of a friendly conversation here? And we've all been friends behind the scenes. So this is fun to have you on here. We're excited.
yeah, thank you for having me. My birthday's actually tomorrow, so of course I'm excited.
Really? That's exciting.
I'm smoking some ribs, which is kind of weird since like that's a dad thing in my mind. Like an older dad like would make his own food for his birthday. Like I would generally choose a restaurant or my wife would make something, but I actually wanted to do this, which was weird to me. I'm like, I've never wanted to, but I do. If I do say so myself, I make some pretty good ribs now. So I'm looking forward to that. And yeah, I mean, it's been a good week so far. It's actually been stunningly beautiful today. So
that's exciting to hear. Now all you've got me doing is thinking about ribs. Yeah. And I don't know whether to be excited for you that you're having you're smoking your own ribs because that sounds so good, or to be a little bit upset because I'm not going to get to have ribs tomorrow. But happy birthday.
I'll send some to you and see if they're still warm when they get to Idaho.
Let's skip out on that.
As long as they pass through Iowa, I'm okay with it. I'll go ahead and take them off your hands there, Kyle. But with that smoking, I probably shouldn't ask. We should probably actually talk about what we're supposed to talk about here. I was going to get into how you're smoking them and stuff like that, but probably shouldn't do that. Then I was thinking of, making the joke of, be careful, don't get lung cancer. But anyway, we'll try to stay away from the bad jokes. John, I am excited to have you on here today because, for one, for those who are listening, if you're or watching today, if you go and you check out and you do rent Enemies in the Church, you can watch Jon as a part of that. In fact, a very significant part of that project. And so you're probably familiar with him, but we're here today to talk about that relationship of wokeness, or are you okay if we call it social justice? Would that be a better term there? Social
I like it
justice.
better either way. Yeah, as long as we understand those are the same kind of thing. I think wokeness has been watered down, or not watered down, but it's been appropriated in so many directions that people
Yeah.
have a hard time recognizing what it is. So social justice has that same problem a little bit, but not as bad.
Yeah. So we call it social justice and Marxism. And with that, I think that's just kind of an interesting relationship. We talked about it a couple weeks ago on the podcast, how it seems like there are some who are coming at it from the perspective of the right, who are coming and saying that, look, there is a difference between these two things, and maybe trying to fit social justice into another realm or align it with other ideologies. But I just wanted to get your take to start off. I'll kind of give you a pretty broad question here. Is social justice and Marxism, what is their relationship with each other? And would you say that Marxism is the most influential ideology on social justice, or is there something else there?
Yeah. And if I might quickly interject, because I think there's a good thing that we can use here. And this actually bounces off of something that you said in the pre-show, Jon, which is we're talking about a river. So wokeness, social justice, whatever term you want to put on the modern thing that we're seeing, that's a river. There's going to be many tributaries on the river, but the Mississippi has a headwater. Despite all the rivers that go into it, there is a Mississippi River that goes up to the end. So that's kind of the question. I think that's the question we're getting at, is what is the core river, even if there are other tributaries? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. And I might not give like the most exact answer. There might be others who would be more opinionated on this in either direction, because I think classical liberalism and Marxism both have there's elements in wokeism, or social justice as we're calling it. So I did write a book, Christianity and Social Justice, and I don't know if either of you have read that or are familiar, but I start with the French Revolution, and I talk about these three elements. That there's this egalitarian impulse that seeks to try to stop or prevent institutions that would prevent this egalitarianism from taking place, from having power, from holding power, sometimes eliminating them altogether. And the only way to do that is through creating some kind of like a central authority, like a government of some kind, that is capable of eliminating all these institutions that supposedly create disparities. So the church, the police, the business, whatever, all these institutions are creating injustice and inequality. And so that's kind of what social justice is. I mean, those three elements. And Marxism is an iteration of that. And I talk about it with a book of that size. You can't really tackle everything, but I'm trying to trace a thread that is the most hopefully influential on what we were seeing at the time, which was in 2020. And so I traced it through Marx, but Marx isn't the headwaters of social justice necessarily. I mean, the French Revolution happened before Marx. Some would argue it's not even the French Revolution, really, but I think that's the first recognizable project that we could say that is social justice, and everyone would pretty much agree that who studied the issue. So anyway, so I talk about Marxism, and then I go forward all the way to critical race theory and explain what that is, and how that connects. And I think it connects in the sense that there's a development. Marxism is just one piece of the ladder, I guess, one rung on the ladder that you step up, and then it's cultural Marxism, and then it's the French deconstruction, perhaps, and the Frankfurt School and critical race theory. But there is a rung that I mention in the book that I didn't spend a lot of time on, and I'm looking back wondering I probably could have made the book better if I did, but I didn't want to confuse people too much. I think there was too many names and so forth. So
I know
I
that
meant,
feeling when you're trying to explain something.
yeah. So I mentioned that there's this reform movements plural, that are taking place in the mid 1800s, and how when the 48ers came from Germany, from the failed socialist revolutions in Europe, mostly Germany, when they showed up, there was already a community that was kind of like them. You have like the anti-Masonry, eventually the prohibition movement. Tied in with this is the abolitionists, the women's suffrage movement. All of these different reform movements all were served as like a fertile soil for those socialists who came over, because they're all trying to rectify some kind of a injustice or disparity that they see in society, whether that's in labor relationships or gender, ideas about gender and the way that we handle that, and or the privilege that comes with being part of a club like Masonry, so forth and so on. And so, what was that? Well, that was already here. That didn't need Marx, right? This predates Marx. A lot of that sprung out of Unitarian and Transcendentalist. We actually had communes, like the Oneida community in New York, where, I mean, all kinds of crazy ideas that if I describe them to you, you would probably say that sounds kind of like a Marxist utopia scheme, and you would be right in a way. But Marx wasn't influencing these people. They were, I mean, even down to free love and that kind of stuff, right? Not eliminating marriage, eliminating ownership of property, and all this. These ideas were already floating around. And so when you read Richard Delgado's book, Critical Race Theory, he says this is what, and I think he's right about this. He says critical race theory comes from a number of different influences, and he does talk about Marxism. If you remember, the BLM girls said, they is that what they call them, the BLM girls? I think
Sounds right to me.
it was colors. She says we're trained Marxists, right? So she's saying, she's tipping her hat to Marx and saying that there's a Marxist connection here. But Delgado also says there's a civil rights tradition and an American radical tradition, and feminist ideas, and all these things kind of converge into this critical race theory. So I think you could fairly say, if you wanted to say it's Marxism, if you mean by that it uses this basic framework of the haves and the have-nots, and there's this kind of this scientific approach to society, and that things are inevitable. There's going to be revolution and so forth, and that's what we're experiencing. I mean, you could certainly draw parallels there, but it's not going to fit completely. And so those missing elements, I think, are probably better explained because of the background of our country, which is, well, I wouldn't say that at the foundation it was all classical liberal, but there were certainly classical liberal influences, and we become more classical liberal as time has gone on. And there's actually an interesting book called The Demon in Democracy by a Polish someone who came out of Poland. I don't remember his name. I thought I had it pulled up, but I guess I don't. And he's a professor. But this refugee from communist Poland says, I got to the West thinking that it was going to be this great place, and then I realized they have a lot of the same problems that we had behind the Iron Curtain. And so he wrote this whole book, and he compares things like, he says both systems, whether it's in Western Europe or in behind the Iron Curtain, have this problem with, like, they're anti-religion in a way. They disregard it. Religion's not really that important, whether that's the multiculturalism of the West or the atheism of behind the Iron Curtain. They're against tradition and any obligation to the past. They don't think now. that's more so actually in the West than it was behind the Iron Curtain. They're both very ideological. So they have their theory, like a scientific theory for how things should all work. And it works on paper and in their head. And then they force that on society. So it's not an organic approach to what works and really what tradition is, figuring out over time how to live together in a peaceable way, that recognizing it's not a perfect world. It's more of like, we're going to force perfection. So in communism, there's the party tells you what to think and what not to think, and then the party also is able to enforce through government what the party's will is. In the Western democracies, it's not really one political party necessarily. It's like it's a bunch of corporate interests merged with like entertainment and media, and I would say mostly the academy. The academy kind of dictates what's politically correct and what's not. And then of course that influences government. So you could say it's not one and the same with one party, but there is this same kind of totalitarian impulse. And he argues that the further from religion you get, the tighter the state control gets.
Mm-hmm.
And that would actually be true if you look at the American radical tradition. The farther that these guys who were Puritans before, and then they became transcendentalists and Unitarians and all kinds of other things, when they made that transition, that's when it seemed like there was more of a, not that the Puritans didn't already have, they already had sort of a very tight kind of community, like view of the community and how government should regulate and so forth. But after that transition, it became this secular state, and that secular state has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger since then. And so you can see, like without even talking about communism or Marxism, put those on the shelf for a moment, you could see the seeds of this before ever even ever seeing a Marxist show up on the shores of the United States. And so I think I'll let you ask some questions, but I think to wrap it up, the guys who are trying to say, like Paul Gottfried, that this isn't, what wokeism isn't necessarily Marxism, they're looking at a few things. They're looking at two main things, really. The sexual revolution, number one, and the transgender stuff. And they're saying Karl Marx never would have gone for that. Karl Marx, that was the furthest thing from his mind or anyone in the 19th century. That just wasn't really a possibility. And so how do you link that with Marxism? It seems like it's kind of a dubious relationship there. It's easier to link the BLM stuff, but the crazy transgender stuff, that seems like there's something more pernicious, more satanic, more evil. Not that Marxism isn't, but it's a step downward that Marx wouldn't even take. Now Marx did talk about families and trying to kind of get the bourgeois families to be deplatformed, decentered, whatever. But and marriage was was problematic and stuff because but his issue though is different. His issue was that it's because through marriage you would create these alliances in which you would pass down money, essentially from wealth from one generation to another, and then you would keep that wealth in the same families, and it wasn't fair, and use it to oppress. But that's not what's happening now with the transgender stuff. They're literally rewriting reality. And so Paul Gottfried's saying that doesn't fit with any, like you can't find that in any communist state. In fact, if anything, the former communist nations, China and Russia aren't going down this path. They think we're silly, right? And the other thing is he noticed, and I think he's right about this, that the woke people don't seem to have a big problem with capitalism, which is interesting. But liberals tend to, like, and I'm not talking classical liberals, but the left, the progressives, they have tended to have an issue with capitalism. The woke people kind of like are all over the map on this, and they have no problem using corporate interests. In fact, they mostly use corporate interests to enforce their political correctness on people. So when you say something, when you misgender someone and you're fired for it, it's your employer who's doing that. No government is coming in and twisting that employer's arm. The employer is doing it voluntarily because of pressure, perhaps from a woke, political action group or something that threatens to boycott them if they don't. But but they're fine using the market for their own ends. So anyways, there's just a lot of decadence. There's a lot of material prosperity and a lot of pursuit of pleasure, and all of these things mark Western democracies in ways that they didn't mark, at least as much, the communist countries. And from this we have a lot of the sexual stuff. So so anyway, yeah, I'm rambling at this point, but hopefully that's a full.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's clear.
Yeah. I definitely think it's you're bringing up something here, because basically what you're getting at is that idea of classical liberalism within the French Revolution. Kind of the idea is, and I'm just the French revolutionists that I know the most, his works would be Thomas Paine, because even when studying the French, I'd rather read an American, or at least somebody who's attached to America, but it's basically that concept of getting to rewrite the social contract, or the rights of man, that they're not something that's inherent from God, but it's every new generation, essentially. I'm way oversimplifying this, but every new generation gets to write their own contract, gets to write their own rules, their own rights, and in that kind of a sense. And of course, that is something that was within Marxism. Interestingly, with Marx, and when you're going through that progression, I think that there are some things that you can definitely see that would have that idea. But I did find it I do find it a little bit interesting when you're talking about Marx in the sexual revolution, because Marx, obviously with the family, and you're correct, it was for different means, but he did want to abolish the bourgeois family, and the sense was basically you get rid of capital and you'll get rid of the family. And he thinks that the whole reason you have that family construct is to pass down that wealth with that, and to keep others out and to box it out. But Marx himself had terrible sexual ethics, and was an adulterer, wasn't a good guy in that. And so I don't know that we could say completely that he would be against the sexual revolution, in the sense of, sure, at that time the debauchery wasn't as bad as what it is today with the homosexuality, and obviously there wasn't the concept of transgenderism. But I think it's more of just, simply that sense of it perhaps hadn't progressed that far. But then the other thing that you bring up with the woke today, or social justice wanting to use corporations, Marx did as well, in a sense, use that, because he was funded by Engels, in the same kind of a way. He was going and receiving that from capital, from somebody else who's making it. So I would say a Marxist isn't against using capitalism. They're just trying to use capitalism to go and to destroy capitalism if they can. But they're not opposed to finances, and they're not opposed to, hey, if somebody's benefiting from capitalism, to use it to destroy themselves, that's good. But it seems like, and I think this is maybe where the conversation needs to find out, because it seems like you skipped over cultural Marxism quite a bit, because I think it's obvious to say Marx wasn't woke, or wasn't social justice, in the sense of he wasn't a cultural Marxist. He was trying to use, a physical revolution. It was an economic theory, but it was when that economic theory and those principles get applied to the culture that I think that's where we really see, that's the child, the child of that cultural Marxism, or really just the further arm of that, is undoubtedly, social justice and wokeness. Like, I guess, what are your views on cultural Marxism? Would you say that that's a legitimate son of Marxism, or are you trying to say that that's something different as well?
Well, it's a development of Marxism. I mentioned it in passing, but I have a whole section in my book about it, and I certainly think that influences the social justice stuff. I don't think that Patrisse Cullors would say that we're trained Marxists if she hadn't been a trained Marxist, that she wasn't getting this from With her, it would have probably been Gramsci, or maybe she would have been getting it from some Frankfurt School folks. But so I don't deny that there's a connection. I think that the academics of the United States have been steeped in, among other things, Marxist political theory for years. So certainly that has to influence what we're looking at. I think the question that Kyle had was, what are the headwaters? And I think what I'm proposing is that there is a headwater. We could maybe label it modernity or something like that. And we could say that Marxism and classical liberalism both flow from this, which is why there's similarities between them. They both have certain assumptions. They both lead to similar places. They both have actually kind of a utopian vision. It's different, but if everyone were to comply, that we would be living in essentially a utopian state of some kind. So, once you get away from religion, you start de-emphasizing man's sin. Men are perfectible. It's these problematic right-wing bigots or something. You have your class that's holding everything back, and we can find a mechanism to get take them out or something. And I think that gets to the heart of what the transgender thing is. It's not really about economics. I would say that is the big difference between Marxism and transgenderism, is that you could say Marx, maybe if he lived to 2023, he would have been pro-trans, but the logic being utilized to push the transgender agenda is basically just to rip on Christianity. It's to rip down the church, to rip down any authority from natural revelation or special revelation. It's to try to. It's 110% against the Creator, and it doesn't need any other justification. It doesn't need an economic justification, right? It doesn't matter what kinds of damage that it does, the surgeries, or what kinds of people losing their job, whatever, all the sacrifices must be made in order to deconstruct creation itself. So, it is a little, it's dangerous for historians to go back with things that are present and then to try to impose on the past. Would this person who wasn't exposed to these ideas necessarily have adopted them? Yeah. Maybe Marx would have, I don't know, but his motives for sexual degeneracy and so forth are certainly different.
Well, Marx also said his goal in life was not just to destroy capitalism, but it was also to dethrone God. And so, I mean, there is that concept of Marx was not in favor of God, and you can see that in his younger works specifically. I'm sorry to go nerdy here, but if you read his poem, the Player, I believe is what it is, where he basically depicts himself as a fiddle player who goes and ends up burning himself, playing so hard and so fast, and pictures himself there, and basically sends himself to hell with making a deal. It's weirdly reminiscent of The Devil Went Down to Georgia in some ways, but and
Charlie Daniels has a beard just like Marx. Yeah.
So, making some. I
haven't seen them in the same room together.
That's true. Yeah. But with that, I don't think that Marx's main beef with capitalism was. I definitely think there's a selfish aspect to it in wanting to destroy it, but I don't think it's just purely a secular aspect of going and saying, "Hey, I think this was good." I think it was also in some ways, shaking his fist at God, being against the material world and against the principles that are in Scripture, because we can see true capitalism scripture or principles founded all throughout Scripture, and the free markets and things of that nature. But I do think there is a religious aspect and a shaking of the fist that Marx had towards God. Do you see that? And because I know that you're a fairly accomplished historian, but it's not just from a secular aspect or a Darwinian aspect. He has a hatred towards God, wouldn't you say?
Sure. Yeah. And people have recommended to me, I've read Richard Wurmbrandt's book on it, and Marx and Satan. And there's a lot of compelling things there, but we could say the same thing about Hitler. We could say, Hitler really hated God too, and we could pull out all the quotes, and he wanted to go back to this Volk religion that was basically pagan and that kind of thing. But if we were to try to say that, and Hitler also was sexually indecent with he didn't marry Ava Braun, and so we if we were to try to take that alone and then make a tenuous connection to, and I bet he would have supported transgenderism or something, we would be wrong though, because the Nazi Party actually was getting rid of that kind of thing. That kind of thing was starting in Berlin, where they were doing these sex reassignment surgeries, and the Nazi Party was very against it. So I'm only bringing that parallel up to say that you can have someone who's very against God, very demonic, is for evil, but they might not necessarily, or I should put it this way, there's not evidence to support that they would have been for the form of evil that we're currently undergoing, just because they were for previous forms of evil, which is what I think I hear you saying, is that because he wanted to dethrone the bourgeois family because it stored wealth for generations to come, and it had that link to the past and those obligations to the past and so forth, and it wasn't fair. And combining that with Marx's indiscretions personally and his hatred for God, then making the jump to say, well, I think he would have probably also, or his ideas were built upon and flowed to their necessary conclusion, which was transgenderism. I don't think you can make that. Now, it could be true that Marx would. I mean, I'll grant you that if he were around today, it's possible he probably need a little bit of like a development, but I don't think it logically flows from his writings.
Do you think that Joe Biden is woke or social justice? Would you categorize him in that way?
He's an opportunist. I don't know that he supports whatever policies in front of him, I think, and they tell him. So the people behind him, whoever they are.
Functionally, that's who we're talking about, the people behind him, not because he's a senile old man.
Yeah. To be fair, I don't know if he knows what his name is, but the point more that I was trying to get at with that is, I don't think necessarily that Marx or to say Hitler would be a good example of this. I don't think that either one of them would be personally transgender. Maybe Marx, I have no idea. He was a really big degenerate, but not that Hitler was an upstanding guy by any stretch of the imagination. But in looking at that, I think that even today, though there are of course are woke people who are transgender or think they want to change genders or whatever, they've got gender dysphoria. I don't think that that's necessarily the main thing that's there behind wokeness or social justice. I really think the goal is more to destroy what's before in order to gain that power. And that's always kind of the goal of Marxism, is that it's to create a class warfare wherever you can. It's not necessarily caring so much where the class warfare is, specifically when you get into the cultural Marxism. It's just to go and to find those warfare, those class warfares. So I don't know that necessarily the specifics of transgenderism relates, because if there was an opportunity for Hitler to exploit transgenderism to get to the top and then to kill the transgenders, I certainly think that's what Hitler would have done.
Yeah, I don't know whether. I mean,
do you think Hitler was
at that point where,
in that sense,
to some extent, I do think he had.
Well, I mean, the Nazi Party, in many influential positions, had openly known gay people. Yet he didn't apply the law equally to them.
He did protect some of the more privileged ones, but but they were very much anti. Like, their official party line was they were anti-homosexual, which of course a lot of hay is made of that today.
They just
even though they were also
applied it.
Yeah, and they were also socialists, right? So it was a different form of socialism.
Mm-hmm.
It was fascism. So my point is not a very dogmatic point. It's more of like, I'm just putting the burden of proof on someone who wants to try to prove that connection and saying you're going to have a hard time. Like, that's all I'm saying.
Well, and now I don't think Sam's point, if I could, because I think Sam got a little bit distracted, so I want to bring it back to this, because I don't think his point was to say that Marx and, if he was in 2023, he'd support all the woke stuff. I think his point was to push back a little bit on what you were getting at, of you were drawing a distinction between Marx on certain issues and social justice. And Sam was pointing out that no, the thread was clearly there. The aggressive 100%, 110% against everything that is God's also existed within Marx as well. It's just the execution of it is now we're seeing it sort of in an unhinged state. Now, if I could throw into that,
yeah,
I think that's the biggest reason for that. Well, two big reasons. One is the difference between modernism and postmodernism. So a postmodern version of Marxism is going to be more chaotic by nature, just like a postmodern version of liberalism is more chaotic by nature. It has no grounding. But I think the other thing is that Marx is coming before Nietzsche. Now, obviously, there's an overlap between the two men, but really the times when they're active and the times when people are picking up what Nietzsche is putting down, you see a society that is still, even in Marx, you're still seeing an appeal, despite a complete rejection of God, you're still seeing a sort of appeal to a rational world. Whereas Nietzsche is pointing out, hey guys, no, if God is dead, you don't get to go through his pockets. Everything goes with him. Nothing is off the table. And from there, you see this more extreme forms developing. So again, I kind of think that's what Sam was getting at, was just not to say, hey, the modern forms are divorced from Marx on these issues.
I think you're making, though, the point I'm making, because you're saying that there's an extra ingredient here. So it's not just...
I mean, there's always going to be extra ingredients. Again, it's what tributaries are forming the mainstream.
Right. So I think the argument that, now Paul Gottfried's not here to make the argument, but if he was, he would probably point to the decadence of Western democracies and the immoral lifestyles that they, not just people hypocritically do in a corner, something that they wouldn't support on paper, but they'll do because they're bad people. But no, like the actual public acceptance, normalization, and endorsement of horrible sexually degenerate things. I mean, I just saw that movie earlier this week, Sound of Freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you think about the fact that there are more slaves and they're sex slaves in the world today than there's ever been. And the United States is one of the largest consumers of child pornography and sex slavery. If that's the case, how is that? How do you square that with, the land of the free, the place where everyone's supposed to be equal, where we're against misogyny and all these things? How is that possible that kind of thing happens? And of course, these people are doing it in a dark corner. But I think the thing that we're starting to recognize is how far are we from actually normalizing this? Are we 10 years away? Are we 20 years away? We've seen in the last 20 years such a normalization of so many different deviancies. And it doesn't at least seem to have taken an extra shot in the arm of Marxism to do it. It seems like it was more or less the prosperity, the debauched entertainment, the introduction of internet pornography, the mass transportation and mass access to these things. All of that stuff. I mean, you can mix in obviously the other foundations of evolution and other things that people are learning that makes them think that they can act like animals. but you program a people this way, or you get them used to it over a period of decades. And it's not really any wonder that they'll now turn around and say, well, you know what? Gender can be a social construct, because the highest good is the pleasure that you get. It's actually, this might be a good illustration to talk about this, because I think that the people who want to say it's all Marxist or want to lean that direction, they tend to be the 1984 kind of folks. If you've read that novel, they tend to see like this overarching totalitarian government that comes in, right? That's like communism. and then dictates to everyone and forces you. So it works through coercion. The Brave New World by Huxley was written, not I can't remember if it was before or after, but I think it was after. And they're often compared to one another because they have similar outcomes in a way. But in Huxley's novel, we don't have a totalitarian government coming in and telling us what to do. We're choosing it. We're taking soma, right? And so have you guys both read that book, or
familiar?
If you haven't, you should.
No, yeah. No, and I get what you're getting at, because I completely agree with the analogy you're making there.
The people who are saying, like, I think Chronicles Magazine, when they're trying to say it's not really, they're saying it's not 1984. This is Brave New World, kind of. And that, I don't want to quote in the authors, misquote them. I'm assuming here that they might generally agree with that. And so that seems to be a better explanation for how we got to the point that we're at right now, through sinful, really this sort of liberal, this liberal default setting that says that there's no place for religion in the public square, multiculturalism, anyone's creed or religion is supposed to be equally recognized. That extends now to your sexual habits. And really, you should be able to do anything that you want to do, right? Except cramp on other people's styles and tell them that they can't do the things they want to do, right? So that's not something that you found in any of the communist countries, really. You would see the party elites at the top doing what they want to do, like they're going to follow their vices, but it wasn't for everyone, right? They couldn't get elected by promising people that they're going to loosen standards of morality and let them divorce their wives at no fault or something like that. That wasn't the case in communism. In communism, it was very regimented. It was 1984. They had a structure. There was even to some extent an enforced morality of sorts. You didn't have the same access to all the decadence and or even the ability to pay for it. So out of which place would you naturally have, would transgenderism naturally arise from, and everything we're dealing with today on the sexual revolution front? It seems like it's out of that corporate world of Las Vegas. It's out of Las Vegas. All the fantasy island stuff right there in front of you. You can pursue to your dream's content, and no one should tell you to stop.
So
something. Because I want to quickly get this in, Sam. Sorry.
Okay, go for it. No problem. No problem.
I know I said I'd let you do a little bit more, but the whole sexual thing of now, because we talked about, we did an episode where we talked about one of the Gottfried articles, Marx was not woke, and we were not very charitable to that article. And we're trying to fairly represent it, and we went really through it rather than just quotes of it. But you've alluded to this as well, that communist countries had a almost stronger view of morality, or a view that's almost closer to Christian morality than Western countries, than liberal countries. Now, and specifically on the issues of sexuality. But that seems to be...
It could be that time froze in 1920s when the Bolshevik Revolution happened. It could be that...
Yeah, but the Bolsheviks in Lenin's Russia, they legalized homosexuality.
So
they even sent delegates to another institution that Marxists were heavily involved in, the German Institute of Sexual Science, that was really trying to create acceptance of and promote homosexuality. The USSR sent delegates to it. It wasn't until 1934 under Stalin that it was recriminalized, and that was mainly under pressure from peripheral states like Poland, Kazakhstan, others that were fiercely religious, much more so than even Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and sort of the central territories. So that's what confuses me, because the early Marxists and the early communists were pro-gay until they came up against social pressures from the people who weren't accepting the revolution.
Well, that was one of the complaints the Nazis had. That's why there was a transgender or a gender reassignment surgery facility in Berlin that they were against, and they were against the decadence that, I mean, some of the book burning that the Nazis did was against these sexually decadent books and so forth. So I don't disagree that that early communists definitely had there was this kind of looseness, this sexual looseness. What I'm saying is that never really caught on with their populations, and I think, as you just rightly observed, Stalin reversed it. Now, I wasn't aware that that was for religious reasons. I thought that was more for reasons of order. But
Well, it wasn't religious; it was pragmatic, because obviously Stalin's not religious by any means. I'm saying the cultures that were more on the fringe, that were forced into it more so than the core groups, rebelled against these things more so than the people that were obviously Russians were more on board with the revolution.
Right. And it wasn't though a priority to force that stuff on the masses to the same, not anything parallel to what we're seeing today, at least at least in intensity. And then the other thing I would say is, you see today with Xi and with Putin, and we can debate whether or not the Russian Federation is still Marxist or whatever, but I think there's still there are ties.
They're very socialist at the minimum.
Yeah, I mean, they're criticizing the West for the West's stupidity in adopting all these things. So either there was a course correction, and I'm not a Marxist scholar or anything. I don't think maybe I'm not even the best person to be asking about this subject, but either there was a course correction somewhere along the line, or it was never to the intensity that we're seeing today.
So I think where the line can be drawn is that the West fell to Marxism by means of cultural Marxism, but mostly the nations that you're going and putting out, it was a bloody revolution that got them to be there, which is a lot more in the non-cultural sense. But that doesn't change the fact that
it took tens and tens of millions of people to maintain the Marxist state there.
Right.
Dead people. It took that many killings because people would not submit.
Well, so I think that's where it's important to examine the idea of, is cultural Marxism actually Marxism, or is it something else? I would contend that it is Marxism, and that's the obvious main thrust in woke and social justice. But I do want to point this out too, because I think this is important for everybody listening to understand. I'm in complete agreement on the on basically that we need God's laws to bind us, and that's where we need to be. That conservatism is the right answer. I don't think that, because I think you're pointing out something that's important that I'd kind of like to flesh out as well, is that a lot of the people who are coming up and calling everything Marxism within the woke side, they're attaching classical liberalism to it. And I don't think that classical liberalism, or any kind of liberalism, can put up any fight to Marxism. I think that it always gets run over by Marxism, and that's why it ends up losing. But I don't think that Marxism is coming from that. I just think it's going through that, because it's not a good defense to conserve a nation or a morality. And righteousness ultimately is what exalts a nation, and sin becomes that reproach. Because I also don't think that you'd be saying that the communist nations that came about by bloody revolution, I don't think that you're saying that they're moral nations by any stretch of the imagination, which I imagine is, well, I've seen it on Twitter. That's what I don't think that the classical liberals would say, that you're saying that, oh, you're saying that Russia's a good moral nation. I don't think you're saying that. So I do kind of want to make those things clear.
The communist nations, but all I'm saying is that the communist nations didn't value the individual going on a journey to find themselves through the eyes of the other, and then their races and their gender is a social construct. That's these interconnecting experiences. It's all very abstract, but you kind of come into your gender over time. Like that would have been silly. None of them would have gone for that. They did, because they never even stressed, like, the individual didn't really matter, and the individual's journey to figure out in the social setting what they were. Whereas that is like the chief good thing that our more capitalistic, you could say, but I guess Western democratic societies, that's the direction they've gone, is looking at that. So you could try to pin that on cultural Marxism, I guess, but I don't know that cultural Marxism gets you there. I mean, cultural Marxism just takes Marxist economics and says it's cultural factors, not economic factors. But you're still thinking in terms of corporate groups and stuff. You're not trying to protect these individual rights, and that's one of the things that the transgenders ism thing is. They're cruising forward on individual rights, and that's what they're trying to say.
But
Of course, we don't agree.
Is it
Go ahead.
really individual rights, though?
No, it's not. But they're using the language that we're comfortable with, that we understand, and of course, when we have a different conception of individual rights, I think, than most classical liberals today too, because we would tie them to responsibilities and say it's there's a telos to it that God's given us. But
I would say it's proletariat
that,
rights that they're coming from, though, because they're saying that transgender as a group, not as an individual, have the right. They're calling them a people group.
They do both. They do both.
Well,
but the highest, I think, the highest good though is an individual coming into their own and figuring out who they are, and then I mean, I'm trying to think what the language is, because I hear it all the time and now I'm blanking on it, but there's a phrase that girls say a lot in particular. I can't think of it now, but like self-care kind of stuff. That wasn't the word, but that works. It's very innerly focused on yourself. You're in a room full of mirrors looking at yourself in Western societies. Everything is devoted to you and how it makes you feel. In communist societies, it wasn't supposed to be that way. It was all supposed to be you exist for the corporate group, and that's it. Right. But, so whether or not, I mean, they would arrange things similarly because it's inescapable. You have to think about groups. You can't not think about groups if you're going to think about politics. I think, though, that the priority, though, in Western societies has been individual expression through sexuality. Is like that's again, that's the highest form of good.
But then it's LGBT. I mean, it is a group that they're bringing up that's oppressed. I mean, yes, transgenderism is the
right. I'm not saying that the organization,
but I mean, it's the hot button issue right now.
So we're talking about two different things, though, I think, because you're talking about organization and I'm talking about priority. So like the you can look at the group and say there's this group and they have rights and we need to fight for those rights. But I'm saying the reason that in Western societies we need to fight for them is because every individual should be able to pursue their own good, and that means the rest of society must conform to that, whatever that is, however weird it is. If they want a litter box in the school, society must conform to that. Communist societies wouldn't do that because they say we don't have to conform to all the freaks. They have to conform to us. Does that make sense? I don't know if are we in agreement or no?
Yeah,
are we
but
still in disagreement?
Communism itself isn't. Well, Stalinism is a branch of communism, and frankly, I think Gottfried was using Stalinism and communism kind of interchangeably. He was being a little bit too loose with the terms because communism is more than just Stalin. But
did he say class? I don't remember the article. Is it classical Marxism he was talking about?
Well, he kind of.
I think it was Marx he was talking about. It was Marx woke.
He would slip between different terms when talking about things. He'd refer to Stalin and kind of the Iron Curtain under the Stalin era as kind of representative of all communism, which that's why I brought up the sexual stuff pre-Stalin, because it was different. But that's there's different iterations of communism that are all still recognizably communist, but communism is not classical Marxism. They're not equivalent terms in a one-to-one sense. You know, it's in communism in the
wasn't communism the final state of where?
Yeah, but we're talking about practical communism. We're talking about communist states because communism is an idea that it's impossible. So communist states,
You don't believe in the utopia, Kyle.
the
Yeah, they're all gonna be different.
political entities that we refer to as communism, which is more defined, is not interchangeable with classical Marxism. There's multiple ways to get around it or get around to it. And I think that was kind of the point of cultural Marxism is, hey, guys, that route is not going to be the route that wins, especially not in the West, because the West is already more so than Eastern Europe was already so, it bought into Enlightenment rationalism. Because let's be clear, that's what we're talking about. All of these are grandchildren of Enlightenment thinking, whether it's classical liberalism, Marxism. That's their kind of main common origin. But isn't that kind of the criticism of cultural Marxism is this is why it's failing in the West, is because that's never going to work here. We need to, and then when you jump to America, amplified tenfold, we need to appeal to the individual and specifically the selfishness of the individual to get them to conform to and this is, I think, what Stan was getting at. We're abusing the individual, telling them that they're being a unique special flower all by themselves, but they're all pigs being herded into the slaughterhouse. They're going to die as a group. There's no more individualism once they're inside the slaughterhouse. There's no more individualism once they've been pulled into the LGBT community.
You're arguing it's just a stepping stone. That's they're going to pull that ladder away once they get to the roof.
Well, I believe they've already pulled that ladder away. I think that's, again, some of the boiling over of 2020, some of the boiling over in the LGBT nonsense that we're seeing right now is that group identity has been so established that now they can be mobilized as a cohesive class rather than individuals. And I mean, coming from Washington State, I was, immersed in that before anyone else knew most of this existed. And that's how people were treated, is once you were an individual until you were pulled in, and then you were just a cog in the community.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think we went from tolerance to acceptance to celebration, right, on these things in a matter of a decade, which is not even actually. So it's been pretty quick. So I don't disagree with that. I think you're right. But I think I think everyone that we're talking about, I think Gottfried would even agree that is the final state here of he would say probably a Western democracy. Well, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but in either case, and any of these ideas flowing from modernity, Enlightenment rationalism, it's going to end up with this totalitarian state eventually.
Oh yeah, no matter what.
It's because of some very simple things. People are bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And any system that assumes they're not is going to have to maintain order somehow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I mean, it's the same problem either way. I think that here's the reason, and maybe this is something I should have said earlier. Here's the reason I think it's relevant, though, to discuss whether or not it's Marxist. And that is because I think all three of us, I think, grew up kind of with the last few, we have maybe faint memories of kind of like the end of the Cold War era. So, whether or not we remember the Berlin Wall coming down, we at least remember right after that, and kind of the spirit that was in America at the time, which is that we're not them, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not the communists. We're religious. We believe in freedom here. We're right. So that there was this kind of rah America, and it was wonderful times. I mean, I remember in the 90s, like going to Veterans Day parades and stuff, and it was packed with American flags everywhere. You don't see that at all anymore. But anyway, I think we have to realize that we have that, and people older than us have it even more so. That this kind of attachment to things like the pledge and the flag, and they see it. They growing up in the Cold War era, they all saw it as very anti-communist, anti-Russia. Mm-hmm. That was the most evil thing, especially if you were conservative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have now wokeness in 2020, 2023 now, and it would be tempting to draw a parallel and say, hey, remember those Bolshevik Russians that we used to hate, that we killed them all in Top Gun, and I don't know, Rocky movies, whatever. We defeated them. Yeah, they're back. They're back, and it's called wokeness now. And it's the same thing, but I think it's a recognizable villain. So I think it appeals to us. And the danger though in drawing too much of a parallel there is there are differences between them. And if we fight the new enemy using the same methods that we fought the old enemy with, and if we, and I don't even know if we did a great job fighting the old enemy, but
No, not really.
yeah, no, they kind of cleaned our clock a little bit. But if we go about it the same way and we think it's the same thing, we won't make the right moves. And so here's one example. One of the things that is problematic with wokeism is multiculturalism. It hides behind that. It rests in that, and that's supposed to be supposedly as American as apple pie. So that's one of the problems that we have if we want to keep conserving multiculturalism, which we had in the 90s, right? But it's different now because we've in the 90s, not that it was great times, but at least we still had that echo of Christianity that was kind of keeping an order in society, even though on paper we were multicultural, let's say. Now with diversity, equity, inclusion, we are in big trouble, and we have to rethink this. We actually have to start saying, you know what, that stuff's not good. Actually, multiculturalism, not a good idea. It got us here. And we need to start figuring out how to roll that back. I mean, I think that's what the Christian nationalism thing in part is about. They're saying that we reject the proposition nation. We think we're a tangible, real people. There should be a religious order. Those are things that they're trying to go back to. So that's where I think it's important. If we just identified it as Marxism in the Soviet style Marxism, then we wouldn't be looking at things like that. So there's these other features that I think liberal democracies have that need to be reexamined, and we won't reexamine them if we're just saying it's the same old villain, if that makes sense.
So,
Well, that's
so
again, that's why I was trying to. I think the biggest difference, and Sam, I'll let you go off of this, but I wanted to make a statement, not a question. But
okay.
That's why I already mentioned this. But I think the biggest influencing difference between modern cultural Marxism, as expressed in social justice, and classical Marxism is found in modernism versus postmodernism. And again, like I already mentioned, it's when you take away the last foundations of truth, that true chaos, because now contradictions can be true. And we see that within, social justice. And I think even classical liberalism would heavily reject that massively. It'd be an anathema to it. I think even more so, I think classical liberalism has a harder time adapting to a postmodern state than Marxism does. And I think the biggest reason why is cultural Marxism, because the cultural Marxists, they jumped on the wave of what postmodernism would become much quicker and much earlier. And they saw how to appeal to people in a postmodern culture. I mean, it's the same issue that the apologetics community is having right now. They still are trying to fight modernists, atheists,
Right.
modern secular humanists of the 20th century, as opposed to the postmodernists that we're now seeing that believe in contradictions.
Yeah.
So,
I want Sam is holding something back there.
No, well, I mean,
It's fit to be tied.
Yeah, so definitely, I would agree that we're not dealing with Stalin Marxism here. We're dealing with the cultural Marxism is more where I would come from on that. And I agree with that on the multiculturalism. I think that's an interesting concept that you bring up in the book that I wrote, 5 Steps to Kill a Nation. The first step I put is forgetting God, and one of the biggest points that I bring out is that basically what made America great, or the foundation of it in Western civilization or Western society, is the concept of monotheism. And in America specific, of looking at how we were monotheistic. And I mean, it would probably be categorically a Christian nationalist book, because I mean, I'm sitting there arguing and saying, look, we had Sabbath laws. We had blasphemy laws, and the importance of those, and the necessity of having God's law within a nation. And when you devalue that, you go away from that. So I do agree that we can't just go and look at this and put just a specific or generalized American theme and say, hey, let's go punch Ivan Drago in the face, and then we're going to defeat
which would be nice.
Yeah, defeat woke social justice with that, because it is the cultural Marxism. I think John Stormer did a really good job. I totally cannot remember the name of his book that I've read, but he was a pastor from Missouri, and really detailed how the communists, how the Marxists got into these positions of power. But it was that cultural, it was through society, it was that idea of really trying to deconstruct and to destroy the moral fabric of our nation, which would obviously then lead to the things that we're seeing in the woke today. But one of the things that I have a concern, John, is in seeing this is when I look at this specifically in the Twitterverse, which is always a dangerous place to look at stuff. And granted, I can only see a quarter of the conversation, because I've almost completed the getting blocked by all of the Michael O'Fallon crowd. I just have vocal distance or whatever that guy's name is left, I think, to block me, and then I think I've gotten blocked by all of them. But
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, they really don't like when you continually push that they're actually French revolutionists. But I think that there's
I could see that.
Yeah, I really do think there's a difference, though, because I don't think that Michael O'Fallon and his crowd are woke, which it seems like with the modernity and the classical liberalism, that's where you're going and saying that wokeness is coming from, or social justice is coming from. And I don't see
or
that crowd.
It's kind of its primary parent,
right? And I do think it's
yeah.
Marxist.
It could have more than one parent. Yeah.
It generally takes two, I guess. But in looking at this, where I think there's a danger is in going and putting the guns on the wrong enemy, from the Christian nationalists going and saying, hey, the enemy now becomes the classical liberals. And I do think there is going to be a competing answer to the classical liberals, but I don't think that they're necessarily the ones that are bringing in what's destroying society, although I don't think they have any solutions to fix the problem. I just don't think that they're actively trying to decay the society that we're in. And so that's where I see it being a danger of
those are good points.
Seeing it.
Yeah. Those are good points. You're both bringing up really good, challenging things I think we all need to think through, for sure. So I think because there's sort of this promise of equality, that this vague notion of equality that we've had post World War II, and this kind of like idea that nations and religions produce strife and conflict, so we need to unite around something other than that. And so we end up uniting around these abstractions like equality or freedom, whatever that is. And I think because of that, we now are in a situation where people are realizing this. Maybe the BLM riots is a good example of this, that those promises haven't really manifested themselves yet. That you think, I keep getting told every year, every election cycle, that these other people are holding me back, and we voted and we elected the guy who said he was going to beat them back for me, and he was going to restore the money they stole from me, right? That's the mythos, at least. And then it never happens. You're still sitting in squalor, wondering, when am I going to finally get ahead? And constantly, being told that you will, but you never do. So I think that created or helped create some of the conditions that led to some of the violence and the other things. Is Marxism involved in that? Sure. But the reason I took the approach I just did was, I'm thinking of the guy who's sitting on the couch there. So you could say that there's someone influenced by Marxists, a politician who's telling him these things, but the guy sitting on the couch and I think the more often than not, the promises that he's being given, or the ideas that he's believing, are that he can achieve. That's what America is about. That's any Western democracy is about. That they can achieve. Um, this is the land of opportunity. Things should go well for me, and then it doesn't, because human nature is there's always going to be disparities. There's always going to be hierarchy. It's inescapable,
Yeah.
right? We can never actually. So that egalitarian impulse, I think, was downloaded into both classical liberalism and Marxism. It might look different in different settings, but that
Again,
fundamental,
Enlightenment era. It's
yeah,
one of those things
it's,
that developed in that.
but it's very rudimentary. Like it's very I'm sure that I have that ingrained in me, to the point that it's probably hard for me to even separate myself from it, because I've grown up where I have, right? So I think that's one of the things that people are trying to question with. They're looking at classical liberalism and they're saying that's not the answer. Now, as far as blaming classical liberalism for wokeness and I mean, it can't all be classical liberalism, I don't think, if we want to make a clear separation between that and Marxism. But I think that, like let me give you an example of where I think that you can see, though, this influence. If you look back at some of prescient authors in the early 20th century, like G.K. Chesterton or Richard Weaver, a lot of the Southern agrarians, they all had this kind of this critique of modernity, and they would say things like urbanization, mechanization, specialization, degradation. These all went together. That as people moved to cities to take these jobs in assembly lines and so forth, there was a degradation that happened. There was mass communication. People were uprooted from their roots and their ties to tradition and all these things, and they lost track of the bigger picture because they were specialized in one job, so they couldn't see. They couldn't connect things like people before, who had to do everything on their own on a farm or something. And so this was, they would have all said that this came from William of Ockham, or nominalism, or a combination of nominalism and other things, that produced modernity, and essentially this idea that you can have, that you don't need the forms anymore. You don't need the overarching categories that unite things together. That everything becomes this sort of mechanistic world that we live in, and it's just about manipulation, and that's still kind of the world that we live in. They made very prescient predictions about what was going to happen to the West, and we're talking in the 1920s. Some of these people were saying that we're going to, like, almost perfectly predicting the situation in schools, and with the violence in schools, the situation, how religion was going to fade away, how sexual degeneracy was going to skyrocket, and immoral perversion, and all of this stuff. Like, I've read some of this stuff. I didn't gather quotes for this interview, but I wish I had, because some of them, you just think you're reading a newspaper, and you're not. You're reading people. It's like Huxley in 1984 as well. I mean, these people saw something on the horizon that was coming.
Well,
now,
I mean, my goodness,
it wasn't all Marxism. They saw this as the outworking of what they were living in American society, or British.
Well, I mean, for goodness sake, go read. Who's the father of modernism? At least when we talk about philosophy, it's Rene Descartes. And
sure, yeah,
the kind of traditional marking point of the start of modernism is, I think, therefore I am. And I find it fascinating. Now, I really wish we would have got, I wish his student, Blaise Pascal, I wish we would have seen a full life from him. He died young. But you go read his collected notes, Pensees, and you see him identify the problem. Like, it sounds incredibly modern. Like, he's talking to us without the details. Obviously, people that are closer are talking about the details about where we're going to go. But he really is predicting where modernism is going to take us and its dangers right there at its birth. So it's shocking how many warnings we've had. And I think there is a common rallying point. We've talked about this already, but I think it's good to solidify it with the point you're making there, because modernism Enlightenment rationalism, all of these different things, that is the enemy that we're facing. Why? It's when man said, I can do it without God. It's when the Christian world, first in the intellectual realm, and then eventually that creeped into the common man, uprooted itself from God and said, we can do it we can find all truth through human reasoning alone. And then over time, with things like classical liberalism, with then Marxism, with then cultural Marxism, we started applying that. Okay, if we can do this, if we can find truth without God, how does that affect politics? How does that affect economics? How does that affect the cultural interactions that we have? How does that affect all these different realms? And so there's undeniably a link between all of these different subjects that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah,
and I think it still is important. I think this is the point that we're disagreeing on, is exactly what the primary type of, because all of them have morphed. And again, the transition to postmodernism and then to a just completely post-truth neo-pagan society has been rough on any philosophy. They've all radically changed. But I think that you're trying to say, and Gottfried and others are trying to say, that with this continuing development, more weight should be placed on classical liberalism and Marxism as a river that diverged from the same source in modernism is only something that merged back in and influenced what we now recognize as wokeness, what we now recognize as social justice. Whereas we're saying, no, the primary stream is Marxism, and that's the biggest influencer. Now, I do think this affects how we fight, because it's going to affect what we see as the primary focuses. And again, and tell me if, because we're getting kind of long, so I want to bring it around, and tell me if you think this is a fair representation of things. I think it goes back to what we were talking about the individuals versus groups. And you're saying that the primary focus is more individualistic. It's more American in the American context and influenced by America's version of classical liberalism, which again, everything that touches the United States has to become something, a United States version of it, because of our founding and our history. But our argument is, no. They're focusing that the individual appeal is more of a tactic because Americans are individualistic, but they're really going for the Marxist categories of classes, class warfare, and trying to divide us along those lines. Now, we both agree that it's going to converge back to a totalitarian state that's going to try and build more and more power to itself.
Sure.
But do you think that's kind of the point, that we're starting with a similar origin point, we're starting with a similar end point, but where we're diverging is, again, the tactic that they're currently using? You're more of they're appealing to liberalism, they're appealing to individual. We're saying, no, they're appealing to groups and trying to create a postmodern class, or a postmodern culture-based new proletariat, new bourgeois classes, new Marxist categories based on those. Do you feel like it's kind of a fair point of divergence?
Man, I feel like I'd have to think about it more. I think you're probably right. I think, I mean, in general, that resonates with me. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a complex topic, and I think that people like Gottfried are reacting to overreactions, and then in turn, people are overreacting to his reaction to the overreactions.
I think that's fair.
Because I mean, Chronicles is a political magazine, So what Gottfried is looking at is the myriad, and I mean myriad, of articles, podcasts, just the material that's been produced from the more neoconservative camp. Because Chronicles is paleoconservative, and they're critical of the more neoconservatives. Um, and the neoconservatives have bought hook, line, and sinker that basically this is Soviet Union 2.0. That we just it's time for I remember walking into CPAC in 2020, and the title, the theme of the whole event, Conservative Political Action Committee, was America versus I think it was versus communism or versus Marxism. America versus these things. And I think what Gottfried is saying is like, look, don't think that America word there, that America is so adverse to all these problems that you're seeing with Marxism. There's a problem with America too. And it's not, and it's independent from the Marxist influence. That there's something else that's going on here in the water.
We're rapidly
so,
becoming a leader rather than a follower when it comes to some of these ideologies. And that's a radical new position for America. America was always a resistor.
Well, what is America? When you think America, right, in the Cold War setting, what is America? What do you think of? It's freedom, right? It's, those communists, they can't go and they can't go out whenever they want to, and they have limited options when they shop, and they can't go and worship God or anything. But we're in America, and you can do what you want in America. Anything you want to do. You want to be something, you can be that. You want to, right? So there's this kind of like limitless freedom, supposedly, free speech. We don't shut you up if you say something.
Which I think
of course, we're seeing
you're bringing up a really good point. Something that we could probably talk for 7 hours about. In a ton of agreement that there's a difference.
Let's not.
Let's not do that. But there's a difference between the founding of America and the Cold War America that became much more classically liberal. There is a distinct difference between those two ideas there, because I mean, Blackstone, who is basically the father of our jurisprudence, he was the third most quoted source by the founding fathers, quoting John Locke, goes and says, liberty without law, or there's no liberty without law in that sense. And, free speech, like we don't need to get into that. That'd be, sorry. I didn't mean to derail that. That'd be a great topic.
I could tell immediately where you're going, and that would be a fun conversation.
Yeah. Sorry.
But
whether we should have free speech, that's for another.
Well, not even just what does free speech actually mean?
Yeah, because it doesn't mean what the classical liberal thinks.
Yeah, it doesn't.
No.
Right, and the Bill of Rights only apply to the states. That's another thing. But they've taken them as these universal, these sort of abstract universal propositions that must be applied to everyone everywhere, because they're good for everyone everywhere.
Because they're looking for the Constitution to establish rights, not to acknowledge rights. Because again, classical liberalism, it's godless. Now, it's not godless the same way that Marxism is. It's attempting to be secular, just sort of more agnostic or neutral, but it's still godless. So it needs an origin point for rights outside of God. Therefore, it goes to the state.
Well,
but we're starting to get a little bit off topic. Now, I think we should probably.
I think this relates, actually.
Well, it does. It does totally relate. But as my friend would say, it's a sanctified rabbit trail.
We're running a little bit short on time, and so whether we agree or disagree on if the primary source behind wokeness is Marxism or if it's something else, there is one thing for certain that I think we just established we agree on, and that is that classical liberalism is not the answer. For sure there. And I do think that is important for the listener to understand, that there are going to be people who present classical liberalism as the answer to what's going on in social justice, to what's happening in Marxism. And that's not the biblical answer. That's not the Christian answer. And that's why when it comes to the question of should we have Christian laws, specifically, you have those who have bought hook, line, and sinker into classical liberalism, and they go and they say, no, we shouldn't have Christian laws or distinctly Christian laws. But I think I can speak for everybody when I say this. We should have distinctly Christian laws. Our law should be Christian, and it is getting back to the principles of the Word of God that ultimately is the solution, whether or not we're agreeing on what the driving force is behind wokeness or social justice. How we defeat it is by bringing in more Christianity. It's not by going and saying, let's diversify our moral standing. It's going and saying, let's establish a moral standing.
Yeah.
But on that note, I think it's only fair to
Christendom.
To give you the last word here, John. What do you want to tell the listeners here? This is where, I mean, you could bring out my picture of, as a kid.
I totally agree.
As a pirate suit or something.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with...
Sorry.
I have one of those too. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you guys are saying. As far as like, I think that the solution is Christendom. We need to get back to Christendom. It's not about getting back to this abstract idea of what America is and freedom and these things, which tend to be more vacuous and or at least nebulous. We need to get back to something more firmly rooted. And I think that's Christendom. I think that's, in our context, it's been Anglo-Protestantism. That's not white supremacy. Some people really get that wrong. That means that the traditions, the Protestant traditions that came out of England and affected our law and other things, we need to get back to those things and view them as authoritative. Blackstone, you just brought up Blackstone, is a great example of that. I think the classical liberals, they are half woke. They don't realize it. They think they're fighting the woke. But look, James Lindsay's half woke.
Yeah.
He goes with the LG B, but not the T.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
so where would he have been in 2015? He would have been on the social justice side.
Yeah.
I mean, he told me in 2020 that would be like he was not conservative, right? And now all of a sudden, who's platforming him? All these conservative supposedly groups. So
James Lindsay,
wokeness,
James Lindsay's whiny. He's a whiny guy that his side lost their power.
I was going to say that.
Well, it's true. It's unfortunately true.
That's right, though.
His side lost their power, and he
wants
that power back.
Yeah, and we are all too welcoming on the right to everyone, whether that's Joe Rogan, Bill Maher, Elon Musk. We welcome all these people in if they take one little stand here or there, and supposedly now they're not woke, they're anti-woke, they're with us. No, they're not. They want to go back to a previous iteration of liberalism that you just don't agree with. But I think that this is the march. This is a progressive march that's happened. It's influenced by Marxism. There is no doubt about it. But in the United States, there is an American quality to it. And it's not just this foreign entity that we got to vanquish with America. It's here embedded in our towns and our local communities. Yeah. And so it's going to take men who believe in the Word of God, honestly. It's going to take Christians to go in and really put this thing to death. James Lindsay's not going to be able to do it. He doesn't have the resources, the power, the answers. Christians do. And that's what we got to get back to. So.
Well, I think this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm left with more questions than answers in the good kind of way.
Me too.
Because there's so much conversation that this sparked up. But we have to end at some point. So if this has sparked interesting thoughts in your mind, you can go ahead and contact us, whether you're watching on YouTube, leaving a comment, Rumble, Spotify, you can even comment there. Or you can email us at contactwokepedia@gmail.com. We do read those. We do apologize if it takes us a little bit to get back to those. You guys ask a lot of really good detailed questions. That just means it takes us a little bit more work. But, we hope that this has been useful and helpful. You can go check out Jon, his work at Conversations That Matter on YouTube, or I think most podcasting platforms, as well as I always get your website wrong. It's worldviewconversations.com.
You can go to johnharrispodcast.com now because I bought that domain to make it simple.
Okay, that is definitely simpler because I've more than once typed in the address wrong and ended up at random places that I'm confused. But yeah, you can go to his website, see his books as well. But again, we hope this has been useful, helpful. God bless you. And remember, don't go woke.